In this video, we will take a deep dive into the Damsel. We will break down the storyline, give a clear plot summary, and explore the cast and characters. We will also look at the film's production detail and box office performance. Finally, we will share our reviews along with some personal reactions. So, let's get started. When approaching a film like Damsel, it's worth slowing down and considering why it even deserves a place in today's crowded cinematic conservation. At first glance, it may seem like just another entry in the ever expanding catalog of fantasy driven streaming releases. But that assumption fades quickly when you start looking at its genre, positioning, the sensibilities of its director, and the deliberate choices behind its production style. Let's begin with the genre. Damsel sit at an interesting intersection of dark fantasy and survival thriller, two categories that do not always blend seamlessly. Fantasy traditionally leans toward world building, myth, and spectacle, often inviting audience into expansive universes filled with lore and layered storytelling. Survivor thrillers, on the other hand, are far more intimate and grounded, driven by tension, immediacy, and physical stakes. What makes this film worth discussing is how it attempts to merge these seemingly contrasting tones into a single cinematic experience. Instead of relying purely on magical escapism, it introduces a harsher, more stripped down atmosphere, one that emphasizes endurance and isolation over wonder. Now consider the directorial wise behind the film. John Carlos Fresnadillo is not a filmmaker known for conventional storytelling. His previous work, particularly in the thriller and horror space, often demonstrate a fascination with tension, pacing, and psychological pressure. That sensibility carries over here in a way that feels intentional. Rather than treating the material like a traditional fantasy spectacle, the direction leans into discomfort and intensity. The camera does not observe, it lingers, it constrains, and at times it amplifies a sense of claustrophobia. This stylistic approach elevates the film beyond simple genre expectation and give it a distinct tonal identity that invites discussion. Equally important is the production style, which reflects the broader evaluation of modern streaming cinema. Backed by Netflix, the film benefits from a level of visual polish that rivals theatrical releases, yet it also embraces the creative risk often associated with streaming projects. There is a noticeable emphasis on visual texture and atmosphere, dimly lit environment, a rugged landscape, and carefully constructed set pieces that prioritize mood over grandeur. The film does not try to overwhelm with scale, instead, it narrows its focus using design and lighting to create a sense of immediacy. The use of visual effects is another area worth highlighting. In many fantasy films, CGI serves as a tool for spectacle, designed to dazzle audience with sheer scale. Here, however, the effects feel more integrated into the film's tactile world. They are not just decorative elements but functional components of the environment, contributing to the overall sense of danger and realism. This grounded approach to visual effects aligns well with the survival driven tone, reinforcing the idea that the film is less about escapism and more about immersion. There is also something to be said about pacing and structural choices. The film does not follow the rhythm of a typical fantasy epic, which often built through multiple narrative threads and expansive arc. Instead, it adopts a more contained and deliberate tempo. This decision may divide audience, but it undeniably gives the film a unique identity. It's a reminder that genre conventions are not fixed, they can be reshaped, reinterpreted, and even challenged. Ultimately, it is worth discussing not because it reinvents cinema but because it represents a thoughtful shift in how fantasy stories can be told through its hybrid genre approach, its director distinctive style, and its focused production design. The film offers a case study in modern filmmaking choice. It's the kind of project that invites viewers and critics to pause, reflect, and consider how even familiar genre can evolve when handled with a different creative lens. When examining the production budget of the Damsel, the financial structure reflects a modern streaming era approach to large scale filmmaking. The estimated gross budget is generally reported at around 140 to 150 million dollar, with the effective net cost reduced through tax incentives, particularly from production activity in the United Kingdom. This pays the film in a relatively high budget bracket, especially for a project that is not the part of an established franchise. From a cost perspective, the film occupies an interesting middle ground. It is more expensive than many standalone fantasy films that typically fall within the 70 to 120 million dollar range, yet it does not reach the stream upper tier associated with major franchise blockbuster that can exceed $200 million. This suggests a calculated investment strategy where the goal is to achieve a premium visual standard without commenting to the financial scale of long running cinematic properties. A significant portion of the budget appear to have been allocated to visual effects. Fantasy films rely heavily on digital environment and creature design, and in this case, the integration of a large scale CGI elements would have required specialized team extending rendering time and multiple stages of refinement. These processes are resource intensive and often represent one of the largest cost centers in production of this type. The emphasis on realism and consistency in the visual effects further increase the need for technical precision, which directly impact overall spending. Production design is another area that likely absorbed a substantial share of resources. The films makes use of both controlled studio environment and on location shooting. Studio work, particularly in established production hubs, include expensive related to set construction, lighting, infrastructures, and technical coordination. At the same time, filming a real world location introduces additional logistical costs, including transportation, accommodation, and location specific permits. The combination of these approaches generally lead to higher overall expenditure compared to productions that rely primarily on one method. Labor and talent cost also contribute meaningfully to the budget structure. Projects at this scale typically involve experienced crews across departments such as cinematography, sound design, and post production. Each of these areas requires skilled professional and advanced equipment, both of which increase operational cost. In addition, the involvement of recognizable actors and established creative personnel can raise salary expenses, even if the film is not driven by a large ensemble cost and cost. Post production represent another important layer of spending. Editing, sound mixing, color grading, visual effects integration are require extending timelines and specialized expertise. For a film with strong emphasis on atmosphere and technical presentation, these stages are not simply finishing touches but essential component of the overall production processes. The cumulative effect of these elements add to the final cost, often pushing budget higher than initial estimates. When compared to other projects backed by Netflix, The film fits within a broader pattern of high investment content designed to compete with theatrical releases. In terms of visual quality, some of the platform's largest production have significantly exceeding this production range, while others fall below it. In that context, this film can be seen as a mid to high tier investment rather than an extreme outlier. Overall, the production budget reflected deliberate allocation of resources aimed at balancing visual ambition with financial control. The spending prioritized key areas such as visual effects, production design, and technical execution, while avoiding the escalation associated with franchise level filmmaking. This approach aligns with current industry trend where streaming platforms invest heavily in select projects to maintain a competitive production standard without uniformly adopting blockbuster scale budget. When discussing the genre and the mood of Damsel, the film presents itself as a hybrid that blends dark fantasy with elements of survivor thriller, resulting in a tone that feels more grounded and intense than what is typically expected from traditional fantasy cinema. Rather than leaning into expensive mythological storytelling or whimsical escapism, it adopts a more contained and immersive approach where atmosphere becomes the dominant force shaping the viewer's experience. The fantasy aspect is present primarily through its setting and visual language. There is a clear emphasis on medieval aesthetics, stones, textures, dim interior, and natural landscape that evoke a sense of age and harshness. However, this fantasy world does not feel overly stylized or romanticized. Instead, it carries a raw, almost tactile quality. The environment appears warm and unforgiving. We shift the genre away from idealized fantasy and closer towards something more austere and physical. This grounded visual approach reduces the sense of distance between the audience and the on screen world, making it feel less like an escape and more like an environment to endure. At the same time, the survivor thriller influence play a critical role in defining the film's mood. The pacing is deliberately restrained, often favoring slow tension building sequence over rapid action. This creates a sense of sustained pressure rather than momentary excitement. The film allows scenes to breathe using silence, confined spaces, and limited movement to heighten tension. Instead of relying on constant visual spectacle, it builds unease through anticipation and environmental detail. This approach aligns more closely with thriller convention, where the focus is on maintaining psychological engagement rather than delivering frequent climatic peaks. The tone remains consistently serious and controlled throughout. There is a little room for humor or tonal relief, which reinforces the film's commitment to its darker atmosphere. This seriousness contributes to a feeling of isolation and intensity as the film avoids distraction that might dilute its central mood. The absence of tonal variation can feel deliberate as it keeps the audience anchored in a single emotional register, one defined by tension, uncertainty, and endurance. Stylistically, the film makes notable use of lighting and color to reinforce its mood. Low light environment dominate much of the visual presentation with shadows playing a significant role in shaping the frame. This creates a sense of confinement and obscurity where visibility is often limited and the environment feels unpredictable. The color palette tend to favor muted earthy tones, avoiding bright or saturated hues. This restraint in color design support the overall seriousness of the film and prevent it from drifting into more fantastical or exaggerated territory. The direction by John Carlos, Friss, and Dillo further enhanced this tonal consistency. His approach emphasized physicality and immediacy, often placing the camera in positions that feel close and restrictive. The framing choices contribute to a sense of enclosure, even in more open setting, and reinforce the film's focus on tension rather than spectacle. Camera movement is generally purposeful and controlled, avoiding unnecessary dynamism in favor of maintaining a steady, immersive perspective. Sound design also plays an essential role in shaping the mood. Instead of relying heavily on a continuous musical score, the film often uses ambient sound to create atmosphere. Subtitle environment noises and carefully timed audio cues contribute to the sense of unease. When music is present, it tends to support the tension rather than dominate it, allowing the overall sound escape to remain understated yet effective. In terms of genre identity, the film resists easy categorization while it clearly belongs with the broader of fantasy tradition. Its execution aligns more closely with minimalism thriller that prioritizes mood over narrative complexity. This combination results in a viewing experience that feels both familiar and unconventional. It draws on recognizable genre elements but rearranges them in a way that emphasizes atmosphere, restraint, and sustained tension. Ultimately, the genre and the mood of the damsel are defined by this balance between fantasy and realism, spectacle and restraint. The film does not aim to overwhelm with scale or elaborate mythology. Instead, it focuses on creative or a cohesive emotional environment where tone, pacing, and stylistic choices work together to produce a consistent and immersive atmosphere. When audience approach Damsel, their expectations are shaped well before the opening scene, largely influenced by marketing, genre familiarity, and the presence of recognizable creative forces. For many viewers, the film initially presents itself as part of the broader fantasy landscape, which already carries a set of assumptions. Audience who regularly engage with fantasy tend to expect immersive world, clear mythological structure, and a balance between spectacle and emotional storytelling. However, early impression of this film suggests a slightly different direction, which can subtitles shift those expectations even before viewing. From a demographic perspective, younger audience, particularly those familiar with streaming driven fantasy content, may anticipate a visually engaging and fast paced experience. This group often values accessibility, strong visual identity, and a clear emotional through line. At the same time, older viewers or those more experienced with the genre might approach the film with a more analytical lens, expecting either a fresh reinterpretation of fantasy convention or a polished execution of familiar tropes. These different experiment expectations can influence how the film is perceived, or some viewers may prioritize innovation while others look for comfort in established formulas. The involvement of Netflix also play a significant role in shaping audience assumption. Over time, the platform has developed a reputation for producing high budget, visually compelling content that is designed for global reach. As a result, viewers may expect a certain level of production quality, including detailed environments, strong visual effect, and a cinematic production quality. Including detailed environment, strong visual effect, and a cinematic presentation comparable to the theatrical releases. At the same time, there can be an underlying expectation of narrative simplicity or a more streamlined structure, as many streaming productions aim to appeal to broad audience rather than a niche segment. Genre fans, particularly those invested in fantasy, may enter with specific anticipations regarding tone and thematic direction. There is often an expectation of escapism, a chance to explore imaginative settings and larger than life concepts. However, the film's promotional tone suggests a darker, more grounded atmosphere which can lead viewers to anticipate something closer to survival driven experience than a traditional fantasy adventure. This shift can create a sense of curiosity, especially among audiences who are interested in seeing how genre boundaries are pushed or reinterpreted. Anticipated themes also play a role in shaping expectation. Many viewers may expect elements of empowerment, resilience, and personal growth as they are commonly associated with modern fantasy narratives. At the same time, there may be an assumption that the film will challenge traditional storytelling conventions, particularly those related to familiar archetypes with the genre. This expectation is not necessarily based on specific narrative details, but rather on the broader trend of contemporary films attempting to subvert or reframe classic ideas. The director's presence, particularly someone like John Carlos, fresnadillo, can further influence audience perception. Viewers familiar with his previous work might anticipate a more intense and stylistically controlled experience, with an emphasis on tension and atmosphere rather than large scale spectacle. This can raise the expectation for a film that feel more focused and deliberate, potentially appealing to those who prefer a light, tighter, mood driven approach over expensive storytelling. There is also an interesting dynamic between expectation and uncertainty. Because the film is not a part of a well established franchise, audiences do not have a predefined template to rely on. This lack of familiarity can lead to more open ended expectation where viewers are willing to engage with the films on its own terms. At the same time, it can create a degree of escapism as the original project often face higher scrutiny in terms of originality and execution. For casual viewer, the expectations may be relatively straightforward. A casually polished fantasy film that provides entertainment and a clear thematic focus. For more engaged genre fan, our expectations can be more layered. They may look for innovation in tone, a distinctive visual style, or a departure from conventional storytelling platforms. This divergence highlights how audience expectations are really uniform. They are shaped by individual viewing habits, prior experience, and personal preferences. Ultimately, the expectations surrounding Damsel reflect a balance between familiarity and curiosity. Viewers anticipate a film that delivers on the core element of fantasy atmosphere, visual appeal, and thematic resonance, while also offering something slightly different in tone and execution. Whether those expectations lean toward traditional genre satisfaction or a desire for experimentation depend largely on the viewers, but in either case, the film enters the conversation with a clear set of assumptions that influence how it will be received. When considering the target audience for Damsel, it becomes clear that the film is designed with a fairly specific yet globally accessible viewers profile in mind. Its positioning reflects the broader strategy of modern streaming releases, aiming to appeal to a wide audience while still maintaining a defined core demographic. In terms of age group, the films primarily target teenagers and young adults, roughly within the 13 to 35 range. This demographic is highly engaged with streaming platforms and tend to gravitate toward visually driven content that blends entertainment with recognizable themes. The film's tone and stylistic restraint suggest it is not aimed at a very young children, as it lacks the bright, playful qualities often associated with family-oriented fantasy. At the same time, it does not fully lean into the complexity or thematic density that might appeal exclusively to the older, more niche audience. Instead, it sits comfortably in a middle space, accessible enough for younger viewers but mature enough in tone to bold to hold the attention of adults. Viewers' interest also play a significant role in defining the target audience. The film is clearly geared toward individuals who enjoy atmospheric, visually immersive experience. These are the viewers who appreciate strong production design, control, pacing, and a focus on moderate rather than constant action. It is particularly suited to those who value a sense of tension in environment over fast moving narrative. Audience who are drawn to survival driven storytelling, where the emphasis is on endurance, problem solving, and sustained intensity, are likely to find the films align with their perspective. Another key segment include viewers interested in modern reinterpretations of familiar genre. The film does not present itself as a traditional fantasy spectacle filled with expansive world building and multiple narrative threads. Instead, it appealed to those who are curious about how established genre can be reshaped into more contained and focused experience. This makes it attractive to audience who enjoy seeing conventional ideas approached from a different stylistic angle rather than simply repeated in their usual form. From a genre preferences standpoint, the film is most relevant to fans of dark fantasy and thriller hybrid. These viewers typically look for a balance between imaginative setting and grounded tension. Unlike audience who prefer high fantasy epic with elaborate lore and large ensemble cast, this group tend to favor more intimate, character-driven environment where atmosphere plays a central role. The film emphasis on visual texture, lighting, and control pacing align well with these preferences, making it particularly appealing to those who enjoy a slower, more deliberate cinematic rhythm. The involvement of Netflix also influenced the intended audience. The platform global reach means the film is designed to resonate across different cultural contexts, prioritizing universal themes and straightforward accessibility. This broad approach ensures that the film can engage viewers who may not be deeply invested in the fantasy genre but are open to visually compelling and easy to follow content. As a result, the target audience is not limiting to dictate genre fans. It also includes casual viewers looking for a polished, high production value experience. Additionally, the film is likely to appeal to audiences who follow contemporary film trends and are interested in streaming era cinematic style. These viewers often appreciate projects that blur the line between theatrical and at-home viewing experience. They expect a certain level of technical quality, cinematography, sound design, and visual effects that matches or approach big screen standards even when watching from home. However, it is equally important to note who the film is not primarily made for. Viewers who prefer light-hearted, comedic, or highly dynamic storytelling may find the film less aligned with their taste. Similarly, those who expect complex narrative layering or extensive world building might feel that the film focused approach does not fully meet their expectation. The deliberate pacing and emphasis on mood over action can also be less appealing to audience seeking constant stimulation or rapid progression. Overall, the target audience for Damsel can be described as young to middle-aged viewers who enjoy visually rich, mood-driven fantasy with elements of attention or restraint. It caters to individuals who are comfortable with the slower pace, who appreciate stylistic consistency, and who are open to genre reinterpretation, while it remains broad accessibility through its streaming platform distribution. Its strongest appeal lies with those who value atmosphere, tone, and control storytelling over spectacle and scale. When considering the emotional experience promised by Damsel, the film positions itself less as a comforting escape and more as an exercise in sustained tension and internal resilience. The overall mood leans heavily toward intensity, creating an atmosphere that feels controlled, pressurized, and at times deliberately uncomfortable. Rather than offering emotional highs and lows in rapid succession, the films appear to favor a steady emotional grip, holding the viewers in a consistent state of unease. The mood is shaped primarily by its dark fantasy framework, which avoids the warmth and wonder often associated with the genre. Instead, the tone feels subdued and serious, emphasizing isolation and endurance. This creates an emotional environment where the viewers is not invited to relax but rather to remain mentally engaged. The absence of light-hearted moment or tonal relief reinforces this approach, allowing the film to maintain a focused emotional identity. The result is a viewing experience that feels immersive in a more demanding sense, requiring attention and patience rather than offering effortless entertainment. Themes play a central role in guiding this emotional experience. The films appear to revolve around ideas of self reliance, endurance, and inner strength, which naturally shape how the audience responds on an emotional level. These themes are not presenting in a celebratory or exaggerated way. Instead, they are conveyed with a degree of restraint, encouraging viewer to interpret and reflect rather than simply react. This subtlety can create a more introspective emotional responses where the impact builds gradually rather than arriving in obvious dramatic moments. Another important thematic layer is the sense of psychological pressure. The film's stylistic choices, particularly its pacing and visual composition, suggest an emphasis on confinement and limitation. This can evoke feeling of tension and anticipation as the viewers becomes aware of the boundaries within the cinematic space. The emotional effect is not one of fear in a traditional sense, but rather a lingering sense of uncertainty. It keeps the audience alert, aware that the tone is unlikely to shift in something more reassuring. The intended impact also extends to how the films engage with modern audience expectations. Backed by Netflix, the film is designed to reach a broad global audience, yet it does not rely solely on spectacle to achieve engagement. Instead, it prioritizes a more focused emotional journey, one that emphasizes atmosphere over scale. This approach can be particularly effective for viewers who appreciate films that create a strong emotional environment without demanding on constant visual stimulation. From a sensory perspective, the film uses sound and visual restraint to reinforce its emotional tone. Quiet movement, ambient noise, and controlled lighting all contribute to a feeling of immersion. These elements work together to create a sense of presence as though the viewer is experiencing the environment rather than simply absorbing it. This can heighten emotional involvement, making the tension feel more immediate and personal. At the same time, the film does not aim to overwhelm with complexity. Its emotional experience is relatively direct, centered on a limited set of themes that are explored consistently throughout. This clarity allows the audience to remain connected to the film's core mood without becoming distracted by multiple competing ideas. The simplicity of this emotional focus can be seen as both our strength and a limitation depending on the viewer's expectation. For some audience, the restrained emotional style may feel refreshing, offering a break from more exaggerated or melodramatic storytelling. For others, it may feel somewhat distant as the film does not relatively guide the viewers towards specific emotional reaction. Instead, it creates a framework within which the audience can form their own responses. Ultimately, the emotional experience promised by Damsel is one of quiet intensity and sustained engagement. It invites viewers to remain within a carefully constructed mood where tension, restraint, and thematic consistency take precedence over dramatic variation. The impact is less about immediate emotional payoff and more about the gradual and accumulation of atmosphere, resulting in a film that lingers in the viewers rather than delivering a fleeting emotional surge. At its core, Damsel operates as a conceptual re-examination of long-standing narrative traditions, particularly those embedded within the fantasy genre. Rather than functioning purely as a spectral driven experience, the film's underlying idea is rooted in redefining agency, confronted inherited structure, emphasizing individual resilience within constrained system. The story concept, when viewed abstractly, is less about external event and more about the transformation of perspective. How role traditionally defined by limitation can be reshaped into one of control and self-determination. One of the central thematic pillars is the idea of agency versus expectation. Many classical narratives, especially with fantasy, are built upon clearly defined roles that characters are expected to fulfill. These roles often come with implicit assumption about power, vulnerability, and purpose. The film's core idea challenges these assumptions by questioning whether such rules are inherent or artificially constructed. It suggests that identity is not fixed by circumstances or tradition but can instead be redefined through action, awareness, and resistance. This creates a thematic tension between what is expected and what is possible, encouraging viewers to reconsider the boundaries that define both fictional and real world identities. Closely connected to this is the theme of self reliance as a form of transformation. The narrative concept places significant emphasis on the process of internal change rather than external validation. Growth is not presented as something granted or facilitated by outside forces but as something that emerges from within. This idea aligns with a broader shift in modern storytelling where empowerment is framed not as a sudden realization but as a gradual, often difficult process of adaptation and endurance. The film's message in this regard is understated, but clear strength is not inherent trait bestowed upon a selective few, but a quality that can be developed through necessity and persistence. Another important dimension of the film's core idea is its exploration of system, power, and control. In many traditional fantasy settings, authority is often depicted as stable and unquestioned, forming the backdrop against which stories unfold. Here, the conceptual approach appeared to be more critical. Power structures are not treated as neutral or benevolent. Instead, they are impiled to be complex, potentially exploitative, and deserving of scrutiny. This thematic layer introduces a subtle but meaningful shift in perspective, encouraging the audience to think about how systems are maintained and who the benefit from them. It reframes the narrative space as one where power is not simply experienced but also examined. The film also engages with the concept of isolation as a catalyst for clarity. In abstract terms, isolation is not merely a physical condition but a psychological or philosophical state. It removes isolation is not merely a physical condition. External influence and force a confrontation with internal realities. Within this framework, isolation becomes a space for self-definition where preconceived notions can be dismantled and rebuilt. This idea contributes to the film's overall message by suggesting that moment of separation where challenges can also be transformative. They create an environment where authenticity can emerge free from constraint of expectation and convention. Stylistically and thematically, the influence of Juan Carlos Fresnadillo can be felt in the way these ideas are presented. This approach tends to favor intensity and focus, which complement the film's conceptual emphasis on internal struggle and control environment. This alignment between direction and theme reinforces the coherence of the film's core idea, ensuring that its message is not only conveyed through dialogue or narrative structure but also through tone and visual composition. The involvement of Netflix further contextualized the film's conceptual direction within a broader industry trend. Streaming platforms have increasingly supported projects that reinterpret familiar genres through a contemporary lens, often prioritizing thematic relevance over traditional storytelling formulas. In this sense, the film can be seen as a part of a larger movement toward narrative that question establish the norm and explore new ways of engaging with classic ideas. Another layer of the core idea revolves around the concept of endurance as identity formation. Instead of presenting identity as something static, the film implies that it is shaped through experience, particularly through a moment of challenge and existence. This perspective aligned with a more process-oriented understanding of selfhood, where identity is continuously evolving rather than predetermined. It suggests that who someone becomes is not dictated by their starting position, but by how they respond to the condition they encounter. Finally, the film's abstract message can be understood as a reflection on the redefinition of the narrative archetype. Archetypes have long served as the foundation of storytelling, providing recognizable pattern that audience can easily understand. However, they can also limit the scope of interpretation by reinforcing predictable outcomes. By engaging with this archetype in a more critical and flexible way, the films open up new possibilities for how stories can be told. It invites the audience to question not only the roles within the narrative but also the assumption they bring to those roles. In its essence, the core idea of Damsel is not confined to a single message but rather exists as a network of interconnected themes. It is about challenging expectation, redefining identity, and exploring the relationship between individual agency and larger system. Through its abstract conceptual framework, the film offers a perspective that is both reflective and forward-looking, encouraging viewers to engage with its ideas beyond the surface level of genre and style. At the heart of Damsel lies a central conflict that is less about a single external obstacle and more about a layered struggle between individual autonomy and imposed structure. This tension unfolds not through isolated incidents but through a sustained clash between what is demanding and what is internally resisted. The conflict in its most abstract form becomes a question of whether a person can accept a predefined role or actively challenges the condition that define it. One of the most prominent dimensions of this conflict is the moral dilemma surrounding obligation versus self-preservation. The narrative framework suggests a world where certain expectations are normalized even when they carry ethical ambiguity. Within such a system, the individual is faced with a difficult choice: comply with established norms for the sake of order, or question and resist them at the risk of disruption. This dilemma does not present an easy resolution, as both options carry consequences. Compliance may offer stability but at the cost of autonomy, while resistance demands strength and uncertainty. The tension between these choices forms a core psychological battleground. Closely tied to this is the challenge of navigating trust and depreciation within structured environment. Systems that appear stable often rely on underlying assumptions that are not immediately visible. The conflict emerges from the realization that what is presenting as secure or reliable may in fact conceal deeper complexities. This creates a sense of unease where the individual must constantly evaluate what to accept and what to question. The difficulty lies in the absence of clear audience. There is no straightforward way to determine where truth ends and illusion being. This uncertainty intensifies the internal struggle as decision must be made without complete information. Another layer of the central conflict involves the concept of power imbalance. The narrative implies a hierarchy in which authority is equally distributed, placing the individual at a disadvantage. This imbalance is not merely physical or situational, but it also psychological. The presence of overwhelming forces, where institutional, environmental, or symbolic, create a constant pressure that shape behavior and perception. The challenge here is not only to endure but to find a way to assert agency within a system that encourages it. This dynamic transforms the conflict into an ongoing negotiation between limitation and possibility. The theme of endurance versus surrender also plays a significant role at its core. The conflict asks where persistence is inherently valuable or whether there are moments when surrender becomes a rational response. This is not framed as a simple test of strength but as a nuanced exploration of free silence. Endurance requires more than physical capability, it demands mental clarity, capability, and the ability to confront fear without being defined. It at the same time, the option of surrender introduces a counterpoint, raising questions about the cost of resistance and the limit of determination. The influence of Juan Carlos, fresnadillo can be observed in how this conflict is shaped through atmosphere and pacing. His directorial approach often emphasizes sustained tension rather than immediate resolution, allowing the conflict to unfold gradually. This creates a sense of immersion where the audience is not simply observing the struggle but experiencing its weight over time. The absence of rapid shift or clear-cut solutions reinforces the idea that the conflict is ongoing and multifaceted. There is also a philosophical dimension to the conflict centered on the idea of identity formation under pressure. When external conditions impose strict limitation, the individual is forced to confront fundamental questions about who they are and what they value. The conflict therefore becomes both external and internal. It is not only about overcoming challenges but also about defining oneself in relation to them. This duality adds depth to the tension as such decisions carry implications not just for survival but for personal identity. The role of Netflix in distributing the films further contextualizes the conflict within a broader audience framework. The film is designed to resonate with viewers who are familiar with the narrative of resistance and transformation, yet it approaches these ideas with a degree of restraint. Rather than presenting the conflict as a series of dramatic confrontation, it emphasizes the cumulative effect of pressure, choice, and consequence. Ultimately, the central conflict of Damsel 2024 can be understood as a sustained exploration of tension between imposed role and self-defined identity. It is driven by moral dilemmas that challenge conventional notion of duty and survival, by power dynamic that test the limit of agency, and by an ongoing negotiation between endurance and surrender. The conflict does not resolve into simple binary, instead it exists as a continuum where each choice is shaped the next. This complexity is what gives the film its thematic weight, transforming the conflict into a broader reflection of autonomy, resilience, and a nature of resistance. In Damsel, the thematic framework is built around a set of interrelated ideas that examine human resilience, moral ambiguity, and the tension between tradition and personal autonomy. Rather than presenting these themes in a direct or dictative manner, the film approaches themes through atmosphere, tone, and conceptual structure, allow the audience to engage with deeper questions beneath the surface. One of the most prominent themes is the exploration of ethical uncertainty within structured system. The film raises questions about how traditions are framed and whether they should be accepted without scrutiny. It challenges the assumption that long-standing practices are inherently justified, instead suggesting that they may persist simply because they remain unchallenged. This introduces a key ethical question: is it right to uphold a system if it benefits some while disadvantaging others? The lack of clear moral boundaries encourages viewers to think critically about the difference between traditional morality and whether the two always align. Closely related to this is the theme of individual agency versus collective expectation. The film examines how individuals navigate in environment where roles are predefined and choices are constrained. It raises the question of whether true autonomy is possible within systems that impose strict limitation. This theme is not presented as a simple opposition between freedom and control. Rather, it is portrayed as a spectrum where individuals must constantly negotiate their positions. The emotional arc tied to this theme involves a gradual shift from passive acceptance toward active self-definition, reflecting a broader commentary on personal empowerment. Another significant theme is resilience as a process rather than a trait. The film suggests that strength is not an inherent quality but something that develops over time, often responds to pressure and diversity. Their perspective reframe resilience as dynamic and situational rather than fixed. It also introduces an emotional arc center or adaptation where the focus is not on immediate triumph but on the gradual accumulation of experience and understanding. This approach aligns with a more realistic depreciation of growth, emphasizing effort and persistence over sudden transformation. Another significant theme is resilience as a process rather than a trait. The film suggests that strength is not an inherent quality but something that develops over time, often in response to pressure and adversity. This perspective reframes resilience as dynamic and situational rather than fixed. It also introduces an emotional arc centered on adaptation, where the focus is not on immediate triumph but on the gradual accumulation of experience and understanding. This approach aligns with a more realistic depreciation of growth, emphasizing effort and persistence over sudden transformation. The theme of isolation and self discovery also play a critical role. Isolation in this context is not merely physical but psychological. It creates a space where external influence are minimized, forcing a confrontation with internal thoughts and beliefs. This can lead to deeper understanding of identity as the individual is no longer defined by external expectations. The emotional impact of this theme lies in its introspective nature, encouraging viewer to consider how solitude can both challenge and clarify one's sense of itself. Culturally, the film engages with the idea of reinterpreting traditional archetypes. Fantasy narratives have long relied on established rules and patterns, often reinforcing specific power dynamic and social structures. By presenting these elements in a more critical light, the film contributes to a broader cultural conversation about how stories shape perception of identity and agency. It reflects a shift toward more contemporary storytelling where familiar concepts are revisited and re examined rather than simply repeated. The influence of Juan Carlos fresnadillo can be seen in the way these themes are conveyed through tones and pacing. His approach emphasized tension and atmosphere, allowing thematic elements to emerge organically rather than being explicitly stated. This subtitling encourages a more active form of engagement where viewers interpret meaning based on what is implied rather than what is directly presenting. Another ethical dimension explored in the film is the concept of sacrifice and its justification. It raises the question of whether sacrifice is inherently noble or whether its value depends on the context in which it occurs. These themes intersect with broader decisions about power and responsibility, suggesting that act of sacrifice can be both meaningful and problematic, depending on who is making the decision and who is affected by it. The role of Netflix in distributing the film also situated within a global culture context. The platform's reach allows these themes to resonate with a diverse audience, making them accessible across different cultural backgrounds. As a result, the film exploration of ethical and emotional questions is not limited to a specific cultural framework, but instead invites a more universal interpretation. Emotionally, the film maintains a consistent tone of seriousness and introspection. It avoids overt sentimentality, instead relying on subtitle shift in mood to convey its thematic depth. This restrained approach can create a more lasting impact as it allows the audience to internalize the theme at their own pace. The emotional arc are not defined by dramatic highs and lows but the gradual progression reflecting the complexities of the ideas being explored. Ultimately, the themes in Damsel revolve around questioning established norms, redefining identity, and understanding the nature of resilience. Through its exploration of ethical dilemmas, emotional development, and cultural reinterpretation, the film offers a real perspective on how individuals interact with the system that shape their lives. It invites viewer to reflect not only on the narrative itself but also on the broader implications of its ideas, making it a thematically rich and thought-provoking work. The emotional connection established by Damsel is built less on dramatic storytelling beats and more on a sustained atmosphere that gradually draws the viewers inward. It relies on a careful maintained mood, a set of grounded theme, and a reviewing experience that prioritize immersion over spectacle rather than guiding the audience through overt emotional cues. The films create a space where emotions emerge organically from tone and environment. At the level of the mood, the film leans into a sense of quiet intensity. This is not a loud or exaggerated emotional landscape. Instead, it is the one that unfolds slowly, allowing tension to accumulate over time. The restrained pacing plays a significant role here. By avoiding constant action or rapid emotional shift, the film gives viewers the opportunity to settle into its atmosphere. This can create a deeper connection as the audience is not being pushed from one feeling to another but is instead held with a consistent emotional state. The result is a form of engagement that feels steady and immersive rather than immediate and reactive. The tone also contributes to this connection by maintaining a sense of seriousness and focus. There is little in the way of distraction or tonal variation which allow the emotional experience to remain cohesive. This consistency can be particularly effective for viewers who appreciate films that comment fully to their mood. It creates a kind of emotional clarity where the audience understands the boundaries of the experience and can engage with it on its own terms. At the same time, this approach may feel demanding as it requires patience and attention rather than offering quick emotional rewards. Themes play a central role in shaping how the film resonates emotionally. Ideas such as resilience, self-reliance, and the questioning of imposed rules are presenting in a way that encourage reflection. These are the themes that many viewers can relate to on a personal level, even outside the context of the film setting. The emotional connection comes from recognizing elements of one's own experience within this broader concept. Instead of relies on specific situation, the film taps into universal feeling, uncertainty, pressure, determination, which allow it to connect across different audience. Another important aspect of the emotional experience is the sense of psychological engagement. The film invites viewers to think as much as they feel. It restrained style means that emotions are not always explicitly defined. They often exist beneath the surface, requiring interpretation. This can lead to a more active form of viewing where the audience become involved in shaping their own emotional response. For some, this creates a stronger connection as it feels more personal and less dictated. For others, it may create a sense of distance as the film does not provide clear emotional guidance. The visual and auditory design further enhance this connection. The use of control, lighting, muted colors, and ambient sound contribute to a feeling of immersion. These elements work together to create an environment that feels tangible and immediate. When the viewers become absorbed in the environment, the emotional experience becomes more direct. It is not just about observing a film but about feeling present within its atmosphere. This sensory approach can be particularly effective in sustaining engagement over longer period as it keeps the viewers connected in on multiple levels. The direction by Juan Carlos, Prince and Dilo support this emotional framework through a focus on restraint and precision. His style avoids excess, allowing each moment to carry weight without being overstated. This can make the emotional experience feel more authentic, as it avoids the artificiality that sometimes accompanies more exaggerated approach. The emphasis on control, pacing, and atmosphere ensure that the emotional tone remain consistent, reinforcing the film's overall impact. The involvement of Netflix also shaped the viewer experience in subtitle way. As a streaming release, the film is likely to be watched in a more personal and controlled environment, such as at home. This can enhance the emotional connection as viewers are able to engage with the films without external distraction. The intimacy of this setting complements the film restrained style, allowing its mood and theme to resonate more deeply. Ultimately, the emotional connection offered by Damsel is one of gradual immersion and reflective engagement. It does not rely on overt emotional manipulation or dramatic intensity. Instead, it builds a consistent atmosphere that invites the viewers to participate in the experience. Through its mood, its thematic focus, and its controlled stylistic choice, the film creates an emotional landscape that is suitable but persistent. For viewers willing to engage with its pace and tone, the result can be a connection that feels both personal and enduring, lingering beyond the immediate experience of watching the film. In Damsel, the characterization follows a deliberately streamlined approach where the focus rests less on complex interpersonal dynamics and more on the symbolic and thematic rules each figure represents. From a reviewer perspective, the film prioritized archetypal clarity over layered character backstories, using its main figure as a vessel to explore broader ideas rather than deeply intricate personalities. Starting with a very important main character, the central figure is constructed around a familiar but evolving archetypes. The individual faced with restrictive circumstances who gradually embodies resilience and self-definition. Their characters align with the reluctant warrior or emerging agent archetype where identity is not fully formed at the outset but developed through internal pressure and adaptation. In terms of personality trait, the portrayal leans toward internal pressure and restraint rather than overt emotional expression. The character is defined by subtitle shift in demurier calculation, alertness, and an increasing sense of control. This understated approach can be effective in reinforcing the film's tone, though it may also limit the immediate emotional accessibility for some viewers. The performance emphasizes physical and psychological endurance, positioning the character more as a symbol of resistance than a traditionally expressive protagonist. From an analytical standpoint, the strength of these characterizations lies in its alignment with the film's thematic core. The character is less about individual quirks or distinctiveness and more about representing a broader concept of transformation under pressure. However, this also introduces a limitation. The lack of detailed personal notes may make the character feel somewhat distant. For viewers who prefer deeply personalized arcs, this approach might feel minimalistic, but for those auto-tuned to symbolic storytelling, it provides a clear and focused representation of the film ideas. Moving to the archetype surrounding the central figure, the supporting character largely function with established narrative role. There is a noticeable presence of authority figure who embody institutional power and tradition. These characters are not heavily individualized. Instead, they serve as representation of system and expectation. Their personality traits tend to be defined by control, composure, and a sense of detachment. This lack of overt emotional variation reinforces their role as structural elements within the narrative rather than fully realized individuals. From a reviewer perspective, this can be seen as both a stylistic choice and a constraint. It strengthens the thematic focus on power dynamic but reduces opportunities for complex character interplay. Another category of supporting figure can be described through the lens of functional archetype. These are the characters whose primary purpose is to support the narrative framework rather than to evolve independently. Their traits are often simplified loyalty, escapism, or neutrality, serving to highlight the central figure position rather than to introduce competing perspective. This approach contributes to the film's control and contained tone, ensuring the attention remains focused on the core thematic journey. However, it also results in a somewhat narrow emotional range as these characters do not significantly challenge or expand the narrative emotional depth. The influence of Juan Carlos fresnadillo is evident in this approach to characterization. His style tends to emphasize atmosphere and tension over extensive character development, and this film follows that pattern. Characters are often defined by how they exist within the environment rather than by extensive dialogue or backstory. This creates a sense of immediacy and focus, but it also means that characterization is more functional than exploratory. In terms of performance style, the film leans towards subtlety. Actors are given limited space for expressive range as the tone demand consistency and restraint. This can lead to performances that feel controlled and deliberate, aligned with the film's overall mood. While this approach enhances a sense of cohesion, it may also limit the memorability of the individual character, as they are not designed to stand out through dramatic or distinctive traits. The involvement of Netflix further contextualizes this character strategy. Streaming production often prioritize pacing and visual engagement, sometimes at the expense of deeper character exploration. In this case, the film appeared to follow the model, focusing on maintaining a steady tone and clear thematic direction rather than investing deeply or heavily in complex character arcs. Ultimately, the character analysis of Damsel reveal a film that values archetypal clarity and thematic alignment over detailed individuality. The main character functions as a central embodiment of reliance and transformation, while the surrounding archetype reinforce structural and thematic elements. The personality traits across the board are intentionally retained, supporting the film emphasis on mood and tension. This approach results in a cohesive but somewhat minimalistic character landscape with the emphasis on what the character represent rather than one who they are in a traditional and deeply personalized sense. In Damsel, the acting performances are shaped by the film's restrained tone and controlled atmosphere, resulting in an approach that emphasizes subtlety over expressive range. The emotional impact of the performance comes not from dramatic dialogue or overt intensity, but from a quieter, more internalized style that aligns closely with the film's overall mood. Focusing first on the lead actor, Millie Bobby Brown carries much of the film's emotional weight. Her performance leans heavily into physical presence and control expression rather than verbal or highly emotive delivery. There is a noticeable emphasis on stillness, observation, and gradual shift in demeanor. This approach works in harmony with the film's pacing, allowing emotion to build slowly rather than erupt suddenly. From an emotional standpoint, her portrayal creates a sense of quiet determination where strength is communicated through endurance and composure rather than over display of feeling. While this restraint can make the performance feel grounded and consistent, it may also limit its immediate emotional accessibility for viewers who prefer more expressive or dynamic acting style. What stands out in her work is the ability to maintain engagement without relying on traditional dramatic cues. The performance is less about conveying a wide emotional spectrum and more about sustaining a particular emotional state over time. This can create a deeper, more immersive connection for some viewers as it feels less performative and more organic. However, it also places a greater responsibility on the audience to interpret subtitle cues which may not resonate equally with everyone. Turning it may also limit its immediate emotional accessibility for viewers who prefer more expressive or dynamic acting style. What stands out in her work is the ability to maintain engagement without relying on traditional dramatic cues. The performance is less about conveying a wide emotional spectrum and more about sustaining a particular emotional state over time. This can create a deeper, more immersive connection for some viewer as it feels less performative and more organic. However, it also places a general responsibility on the audience to interpret subtitle cues which may not resonate equally with everyone. Turning to the supportive cast, actors such as Angelina Bassett and Robin Wright bring a different kind of presence to the film. Their performances are defined by authority and composure, reflecting the structural rules they occupy with the narrative. Emotionally, they operate with a level of distance, maintaining a controlled and measured tone that reinforces the film's seriousness. Their delivery is precise and deliberate, avoiding excess while still conveying a sense of weight and significance. This approach can be effective in establishing a consistent emotional environment as it prevents tonal imbalance and keep the films grounded. However, it also means that the supporting performance do not always provide contrast or variation. Instead of introducing new emotional texture, they reinforce the existing tone, contributing to a cohesive but somewhat uniform emotional landscape. For some viewers, this consistency enhances immersion, while for others, it may reduce the sense of emotional dynamism. The concept of chemistry in this film is somewhat unconventional. Rather than focusing on interpersonal warmth or dynamic exchange, the chemistry between performers is defined by tensional distance. Interaction feel measured and intentional, often categorized by restraint rather than spontaneity. This creates a sense of familiarity and control, aligned with the film's thematic emphasis on structure and limitation. Emotionally, this type of chemistry can feel more intellectual than visceral, as it invites the viewers to observe and interpret rather than immediately feel. From a broader perspective, the acting style across the film reflect the influence of Juan Carlos for fresnadillo, whose direction tend to prioritize atmosphere and tension over character-driven expression. Performances are integrated into the film's visual and tonal design, functioning as a part of the overall environment rather than standing apart from it. The result in a unified aesthetic where acting, cinematography, and sound all contribute to the same personal effect. The involvement of Netflix also shape expectation around performance. Streaming production often favor accessibility and consistency, and this is reflected in the film's acting approach. The performances are designed to support the viewing experience without demanding excessive interpretation, even though they remain understated. This balance allows the film to appeal to a broad audience while maintaining a distinct stylistic identity. Emotionally, the acting in this film can be described as controlled, restrained, and immersive rather than expressive or dramatic. The lead actor provides a steady emotional anchor through subtitle shift and sustained presence, while the supporting cast reinforces the film's tone with composed and authoritative performance. The chemistry is built on tension and distance, contributing to a cohesive but intentionally limited emotional range. Ultimately, the performance serves the film's broader purpose, maintain a consistent mood and support its thematic focus. They may not deliver the kind of overt emotional highs that some viewers expect, but they offer a quieter, more measured experience that align with the film's overall vision. When evaluating realism and character depth in Damsel, it becomes clear that the film adopts a selective approach, prioritizing situational realism and tonal consistency over expensive psychological detailing. This creates a viewing experience where characters feel grounded even within their environment but not necessarily explored in a deeply layered or transformative way. In terms of character development, the film leans toward a functional progression rather than a richly detailed arc. The central figure evolves in a way that aligns closely with the film's thematic focus on endurance and adaptation, but this development is presented in a streamlined manner. Instead of offering multiple layers of internal conflict or nose emotional shift, the progression is more linear and controlled. This can make the development feel clear and purposeful, yet somewhat limited in complexity. The film seemed less interested in exploring intricate backstories or psychological depth and more focused on how characters respond to pressure within the present moment. This approach extends to the broader cast as well. Supporting characters are largely defined by their roles within the narrative structure rather than by individualized trait or evolving motivation. Their development remain minimal, functioning primarily to reinforce a central theme rather than to introduce new emotional or psychological dimension. From a reviewer standpoint, this results in a character landscape that is cohesive but not particularly expensive. The film values clarity and focus and at the cost of deeper exploration. When considering believability, the film performs more effectively despite its fantasy setting. The character behave in ways that feel physically and emotionally plausible within the established world. Reaction tend to be grounded, avoiding exaggerated or melodramatic expression. This restraint contributes to a sense of realism, as the character do not appear to exist purely for dramatic effect. Instead, they respond to the environment in a manner that feel consistent and logical. This type of believability is less about realism in a literal sense and more about maintaining internal coherence within the film's tone. The influence of Juan Carlos fresnadillo is evident in this balance between realism and restraint. His style often emphasizes atmosphere and immediacy, which encourages performance that feel natural and unforced. Characters are not overly stylized or exaggerated. They exist within the film's environment in a way that support immersion. This can enhance a sense of realism even when the environment narrative itself is rooted in fantasy element. However, emotional range is where the film show noticeable limitation. The performance and character writing are intentional restraint, resulting in a narrow emotional spectrum. Instead of exploring a wide range of feeling, the film maintains a consistent emotional tone centered on tension and seriousness. While this consistency supports the overall mood, it also reduces opportunities for variation. Moment of contrast, such as shift between vulnerability, relief, or warmth, are less pronounced, which can make the emotional experience feel somewhat uniform. This limited range does not necessarily indicate weak performance, but rather a deliberate stylistic choice. The film prioritizes sustained emotional pressure over dynamic fluctuation. For some viewers, this creates a more immersive and focused experience as the tone remains uninterrupted. For others, it may feel restrictive as the lack of emotional diversity can reduce the sense of depth and relatability. The involvement of Netflix also provides context for this approach. Streaming production often aim for a balance between accessibility and stylistic identity. In this case, the film achieves accessibility through clear character motivation and believable reaction, while maintaining a distant tone through restrained emotional range. This balance ensures that the film remains engaging without becoming overly complex or demanding. From an analytical perspective, the realism in Damsel is situational and tonal rather than psychological. Characters feel believable within their environment, and the responses align with the film's internal logic. However, the depth of characterization is limited by the film's focus on atmosphere and thematic clarity. Development is present but streamlined, and emotional range is intentionally controlled. Ultimately, the film presents a version of realism that is grounded in consistency and restraint. It offers the character who feel authentic within the context of the story, but does not fully explore the complexity that might elevate them into deeply layered individual. This results in a character experience that is effective in supporting the film's tone, yet somewhat limited in terms of emotional and psychological depth. When examining the production budget of Damsel, the financial structure reflects a mid to high range investment within the contemporary streaming landscape. Reported estimates generally place the cost in the range of $120 million to $150 million, positioning the films above standard mid-budget production but below the most expensive blockbuster franchises. This range indicates a calculated effort to achieve strong visual quality while maintaining a degree of financial control. From a cost perspective, the film sits in a category often associated with standalone fantasy or action-driven projects that require significant technical resources that do not rely on pre-existing intellectual property compared to the traditional theatrical release. This budget level is notable for a non-franchise title. However, within the context of the streaming platform, particularly those investing heavily in original content, it aligns with the broader trend of allocating substantial funds to visually ambitious projects designed for global audience. A key aspect of the budget line and resource allocation, particularly toward visuals. Fantasy films typically depends on digital environment creature design and compositing work, all of which require specialized teams and extended production timeline. In this case, the integration of large-scale CGI elements would have consumed a considerable portion of the budget. These processes involve multiple stages, including conceptual design, modeling, animation, and final rendering. Each contribute to the overall cost. The emphasis on maintaining visual consistency and realism further increase the need for technical refinement. Another significant area of expenditure is the production design and location work. The film utilized a combination of studio-based set and real-world environment, which introduced additional logistical complexity. Studio production involved costs related to set construction, lighting system, control, shooting condition, while on-location filming had expenses such as travel, accommodation, and local infrastructure. This hybrid approach is common in film, aiming to balance authenticity with creative control, but it also contributes to higher overall budget. Labor costs represent another important component. Projects within this budget range typically employ experienced crew across departments such as cinematography, sound design, and post-production. Skilled professional advanced equipment are essential for achieving the desired technical quality, and these requirements naturally increase expenditure. In addition, compensation for recognized actors and key creative personnel add to the financial scope, even if the cost is not structured around a large ensemble. Post production is also a major factor in the budget structure. Editing, color grading, sound mixing, and visual effect integration require extended, timeless, and specialized expertise. For a film that emphasizes atmosphere and visual cohesion, these processes are particularly important. The cumulative cost of post production can be substantial, especially when multiple revision and refinement are involved. When compared to the similar film, the budget of Damsel fall within a competitive range. Many mid-tier fantasy film produced outside major franchises typically operate between $70 million and $120 million, making this film slightly higher in cost. At the same time, it remains exceed $200 million. This positioning suggests an attempt to deliver a visually polished product without reaching the financial scale associated with blockbuster level risk. Within the ecosystem of Netflix, the film aligns with the pattern of target high budget investment. The platform has produced both lower cost projects and significantly more expensive titles, and these films occupy a middle ground between those extremes. The goal appears to be achieving a level of quality that can compete with theatrical release while maintaining a controlled budget relatively to the highest end production. Overall, the production budget reflects a balanced allocation of resources with emphasis on visual effect design and technical execution. The cost range indicated a deliberate strategy to combine scale with restraint, ensuring that the film meets modern audience expectation for visual quality and without fully entering the most expensive tier of filmmaking. When discussing the domestic box office performance of the film, it's important to begin with the basic contextual classification. The film did not follow traditional theatrical release model in most regions. Instead, it was distributed primarily through Netflix, which means there are no conventional domestic box office earnings to analyze in the way one would for a cinema release film in markets such as the United States, the United Kingdom, or the other major territories. In a traditional sense, the domestic box office typically refers to ticket sale within a specific primary market, most commonly in the US and the Canada combined. However, because Damsel debuted directly on a streaming platform, its performance is measured using entirely different metrics. These include viewership hour, number of count reached, and completion rates rather than ticket revenue. As a result, the absence of box office data is not an indication of underperformance but rather a reflection of its distribution strategy. From a regional perspective, the film domestic impact can instead be interpreted through platform engagement within key markets in regions like North America and parts of Europe. Where Netflix has a larger subscriber base, the film was positioned as a high visibility release. This type of rollout typically involves prominent placement on the platform homepage, strategic marketing, and algorithm driven recommendation. These factors contribute to the high initial viewership, which effectively replaces the opening weekend box office concept used in theatrical distribution. Audience trend further explain how the film functions within a box office framework. Streaming audience tend to prioritize accessibility and immediacy, favoring content that can be assumed at home with additional cost pre-viewing. In environment, a film like Damsel benefit from lower entry barriers compared to the theatrical release. Viewers are more likely to sample the film without the commitment associated with purchasing a ticket, which can lead to broader reach even if individual engagement vary. Comparatively, if the film had been released theatrically, its budget range estimated between $120 million and $150 million would have placed it under significant pressure to achieve strong domestic box office return. Film with this cost bracket typically aim for hundreds of millions of dollars in global revenue to break even and generate profit without theoretical earning. However, the success criteria shift entirely. Instead of measuring profitability through ticket sale, Netflix elevate performance based on how effectively the film attract and retain subscribers. When compared to the similar streaming first film, Damsel aligned with the growing trend in the comparable budget have also avoided traditional box office metrics, relying steady on internal performance indicator. This creates a different kind of comparison framework where success is measured against other streaming titles rather than theoretical competitors. When analyzing the international box office performance of the film, the first and the last and the most important point is that the film does not have conventional international earning record like its domestic performance. It was primarily released through Netflix rather than through a wide theatrical rollout. As a result, there are no standardized international box office figure available across regions such as Europe, Asia, or Latin America. In a traditional distribution model, international box office would reflect revenue generated from cinema ticket sale outside the primary domestic market. However, for a streaming first release, performance is measured through global viewership pattern and regional engagement metric instead of revenue. This shift the analysis away from financial totals and outward audience reach and reception across different markets. From a regional perspective, the film was positioned as a globally accessible release, benefiting from Netflix's extensive international subscriber base. Markets such as Western Europe, South America, and part of Asia, where the platform has strong penetration, likely contributed significantly to its overall viewership. In these regions, fantasy as a genre generally perform well due to its universal theme and visual appeal, which do not rely heavily on culture specificity. This broad accessibility allows the film to resonate across diverse audiences without requiring localized adaptation. Market reception, however, tend to vary depending on regional viewing preferences. In some international markets, audience favor fast-paced, spectacle-driven films, which can create expectations that do not always align with a more restrained or mood-driven approach. In other regions, particularly those with a strong appreciation for atmospheric storytelling, the film's tone and pacing may be received more favorably because the streaming platform do not release detailed regional performance data. Those differences can be inferred from general audience trend rather than precise figures. Marketing impact play a crucial role in shaping international visibility. Netflix typically promotes major release through a combination of global campaign and localized marketing strategy. Another factor influencing international performance is the absence of financial risk for individual viewers. Unlike theatrical release where audience must decide whether to purchase a ticket, streaming remove this barrier. This can lead to higher initial engagement as viewers are more willing to try the film without additional cost. However, it also introduces variability in viewing commitment as audience may not feel the same incentive to watch the film in its entirety. This dynamic affects how success is measured internationally, shifting the focus from revenue to metrics such as completion rate and sustained engagement. Now we talk about the worldwide gross and break-even position of the film. The analysis differs significantly from traditional theatrical film because it operates within a streaming first distribution model. For a break-even perspective, the analysis become more complex with an estimated production budget range in the range of 120 million to 150 million dollar. A theatrical release would typically require a worldwide gross of approximately 300 million dollar to 400 million dollar to reach profitability. This estimate account for the fact that studio do not retain the full amount of box office revenue as a significant portion is shared with the exhibitor and distributor. Additional marketing and distribution costs would further increase the break-even threshold. However, in the case of streaming release, the break-even model shift away from direct revenue recovery. Instead of relying on ticket sales, the film contributes to the subscription-based revenue stream. Its financial success is evaluated based on its ability to attract new subscribers, retain existing ones, and increase overall platform engagement. When exact figures are not publicly available, the film value lies in its role as part of a larger content library for driver ongoing user activity. The concept of global audience is central through this evaluation. Unlike theatrical release, which may roll out in different regions over time, streaming allows for near stream simultaneously worldwide availability. This means that the film can reach a broad and diverse audience without the limitation of physical distribution. The scale of this reach is a key factor in determining its overall impact, as even moderate engagement across many regions can collectively justify the production cost. Revenue stream in this model are indirect but cumulative. Subscription fee, advertising, and long-term user retention all contribute to the film financial return. Additionally, the film may generate ancillary value through licensing, merchandising, potential of future content expansion. Although these elements are typically scattering in a streaming focused strategy. In evaluating the Damsel, the overall impression is that a film with clear technical ambition and focused stylistic identity thrown out without limitation from a cinematic quality standpoint. The direction by Juan Carlos Fresnadillo emphasized control and restraint, resulting in a consistent tone that prioritizes atmosphere over spectrum. This approach gives the film a distinct identity, but it can also make the experience feel somewhat narrow, particularly for viewers expecting greater tonal variation. The production value is one of the film's strongest aspects, backed by Netflix. The visual design, lighting, and effect work are polished and cohesive. The film demonstrates a careful allocation for resources with attention to texture and environment that enhance immersion. However, this technical strength occasionally highlights the relative simplicity of its overall structure, creating an imbalance between visual ambition and narrative depth. In terms of performance, Millie Bobby Brown deliver a controlled and physically grounded portrayal that align with the film's tone. The supporting cast maintain a similar level of restraint, contributed to a uniform emotional atmosphere. For viewers considering this film, the recommendation largely depend on personal taste in tone, pacing, and thematic focus rather than expectation of traditional fantasy entertainment. The film is best suited for an audience type that appreciate atmosphere, mood-driven cinema. Viewers who enjoy films that prioritize emphasizing tension, visual immersion, and controlled storytelling will likely find it engaging. Particularly appeal to those who prefer a more introspective experience where the emotional impact build gradually rather than relying on constant action or dramatic shit. Fan of genre preferences such as dark fantasy blended with survival oriented storytelling will find the films align with their interests, especially if they value style and tone over expensive world building. In terms of age group, the film is more appropriate for teenager and adult, hence its restrained tone and serious atmosphere may also not resonate with younger audience seeking lighter or more energetic content. It is accessible enough for a broad age range within this group, but its pacing requires patience and attention, making it better suited for viewers comfortable with slow, deliberate storytelling. On the other hand, the film may not be ideal for those who expect fast-paced action, humor, and emotionally dynamic narrative. Viewers looking for richly layered character development or complex thematic exploration might find the experience somewhat limited. Similarly, audience who associate fantasy with grand spectacle and multiple narrative threads may feel that the film focused and contained approach does not fully meet those expectations. The film is recommended for people who value visual atmosphere, thematic simplicity, and sustained emotional tone, while it may also less satisfying for those seeking variety, depth, or high energy entertainment.